My name is Cassandra Lawrence, and I'm the Director of Strategic Communications for the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. And I'm very excited for this conversation that we're about to have with these amazing folks here. This Shoulder to Shoulder campaign, if you do not know, is a national multi-faith coalition committed to addressing anti-Muslim discrimination and violence through engaging faith communities. We do this through a number of programs and projects, including this, our public conversation series. Shoulder to Shoulder connects, equips, and mobilizes faith communities to more effectively address, counter, and prevent anti-Muslim discrimination in the United States. We at Shoulder to Shoulder believe that if we are going to make real change on this issue, it is going to take each and every one of us, no matter our faith or cultural background, to counter anti-Muslim discrimination and to build that community where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. And we know people are doing it, like these folks that are on the conversation with us today. We are striving today to create a generative and generous space where we assume good intentions of one another and where we can be brave and vulnerable to ask and tackle the hard questions. With that said, we ask you to be respectful of the space, use intentional, honest, respectful, and polite language. We will not tolerate any harassment of any sort, and if we need to, we will remove participants. And still, we want you all to know that you are always invited into a brave space long after this gathering with anyone on our staff to work anything out with you one-to-one if you need it. I want to give a special shout out to Nina Fernando, our executive director, who today is operating the tech side of this conversation while I am hosting this conversation. And so it's a fun switch of roles, and I appreciate Nina and all of her amazing leadership for our team. Becca Tyvel is our local partners and operations manager, and she is on the road today, as well as Uzma Saber, our outreach associate. And so we really appreciate them and you for being here. We would love to hear your questions for this conversation, and so please feel free to put them in the Q&A as they come to you. We also have our chat open, and so we are happy to have a conversation and for this to be a dialogue. We are going to, and with that, I'm going to get us started. So there are, I don't know how many of y'all on this call have seen the number of movies, documentaries, short films that have come out recently. Most recently, a movie called Stranger at the Gate made it in the Oscars this year and was a finalist in the Oscars. And so there's been a lot of interest in figuring out how to use films to engage communities and specifically to address and counter hate. And so we wanted to host this conversation with these folks here to really dig into how we do that well and what are the common pitfalls as well as the common joys for this work. And that's why we put this together. This conversation is really intended for you, for community leaders considering using films in community engagement. If you've led several conversations with films before, maybe you're looking for new insights and guidance, or maybe you've never used a film in a conversation. And so this is the conversation for you. Now we're going to get started, and I am so happy to get started here. We're going to have I'm going to first introduce each person very briefly, and then we're going to dive into some conversation. First, we have Aber Kawas. She is a Palestinian American community organizer from Brooklyn, New York, although she'll tell us where she's living now because it is not in New York anymore. And Nina has put her full bio in the chat, and so that's where I'm going to leave your bio, Aber. Pardeep Kaleka is the co-director of Not in Our Town, and he specializes in community hate prevention and de-radicalization interventionists with Parents for Peace, assisting families and individuals entrenched in extremism to off-ramp from hateful ideologies. And we're so excited to have you a part of this conversation, Pardeep. And then Hussein Rashid, who is an Assistant Dean of Religion and Public Life at Harvard Divinity School. His research interests include Muslims and US popular culture and Shia theologies of justice. He also serves on our consultative circle, and so we're very excited to have him. And the idea for this conversation really came out of my conversations with Hussein and like figuring out like how do we sort through and curate all these films to figure out what is going to be best. And so thank you for those conversations and for joining us on this fun trip. All right, so I want to start with Aber. You were starred in an act of worship, which I was lucky to see in Los Angeles at the LA screening and community talkback there. And it was really exciting to see people that were in the film, as well as people that supported the film in one room to have a conversation and to really respond to seeing the film for the first time. When I saw this film, I was struck by a few unique aspects of the storytelling. And one is that it's a story explicitly told from the perspective of you and other Muslim community leaders versus being filtered through an outsider's viewpoint. Can you share a little bit about your story, where you are now, and why this kind of perspective was important to you and the filmmakers, and how that really changes the narrative and community discussions?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Cassandra. And it's also really great to be amongst everyone in this conversation. So like you said, I'm not going to say star, I'm a participant in an act of worship, which is a really, really wonderful documentary directed by Nosheen Dadaboy, who is a Pakistani American. And it tells the story of Muslim Americans through their own voices and perspectives. So we use a lot of home movies and testimonials to tell the story. And an act of worship is really unique as a documentary because it's a documentary that is made, our tagline that we often use is it was made for Muslims by Muslims. And it was not actually made to, I know you mentioned this idea of like stopping hate, or like this idea of like stopping racism, and how films can be just this amazing tool to educate audiences. And an act of worship is a great tool to do that, but it wasn't made to do that. An act of worship was actually made when Nosheen, our director, thought of the movie, she wanted it to be a healing conversation for Muslim communities. And it shows the story the story of the last 30 years of Islamophobic policy that has been enacted in the United States. So before and after 9/11, the after effects of 9/11, and all the way up to the Muslim ban, and all these different policies are shown. But the conversation is not about the policies. The conversation is about how we, as Muslim Americans, feel about those policies, how we were impacted through those policies, and particularly in my kind of narrative in the film, we talk about like my family's story of dealing with deportation, my father's deportation, and how that affected us, right? But like when you're listening to me speaking in the film, I'm not telling you like this law happened, so my father got deported because of this, political narrative. It's really like, hey, when I was 9 years old and I saw my father behind bars, like this is what I felt. This is how lost I felt in life, and this was, just all of the pain that I carried with me. So I think our film is really beautiful in that way of like how it specifically uses Muslim American narratives, and it's made through that insider lens. And there's this line that we often say like about films, like actually that the specific is really universal, right? So I think actually the film ends up being much more impactful in teaching people about the impact of Islamophobia and the impact that it's had on people's lives through policy, through hate crimes, through just their experiences growing up in United States where they were otherized. But it's doing that really through our own personal narrative, and without having the outsider perspective, the insider perspective has allowed this layer to melt away, where you can actually just feel the emotion and the depth of how weighty this has been on us personally and on us as a community.
I really appreciate that you clarified that for us, because it really was like watching the film, an act of worship integrates, and I don't know how y'all got all these like home videos from like the 70s and 80s and 90s of weddings, of kids dressing up for Halloween, I would assume, but I don't know, they're just dressing up, and birthday parties, and how it was really a film for healing versus telling a story. And so like, I'm curious, like, how did participating in the film really change you in that process?
That's a really, really good question. And I, just like you said, the film is, like, I think to make the film was almost like a road trip around the States of like visiting different communities and asking people for their home footage and asking people for those testimonials. So it's really like, it's extremely eclectic and beautiful in that way. And for me, particularly as a participant, I had a really interesting experience with an act of worship. So I was a community organizer in Brooklyn, New York. I worked at the Arab American Association, and I worked for the Take on Hate campaign with the National Network of Arab American Communities. But I was like really based in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, which is like one of the largest Arab American communities in the country, but especially in New York City. And at that time, when Nosheen had like come up to me, the director of the film, and asked me to participate in the film, I was really, really hesitant. And the reason for that is because through my line of work, especially when Trump was running his election, when he was elected, and of course, when he was inaugurated just a few days later was the Muslim ban. So like that entire time period for myself as an organizer and activist was extremely exhausting. And I just felt, but not just myself, I mean, many people in our community just felt like we were constantly on the defense, and we were constantly having to explain to people. And like, you can imagine this is like 15 plus years post 9/11, right? That we're still explaining to people, why, there should not be like racist policies towards Muslim Americans or even like Muslim immigrants, or of course all immigrants, et cetera, right? So like, but we're still having this conversation. It felt just really exhausting. And I was doing a lot of media cycles, and it just felt like my story, and you'll see it in Active Worship if you've seen it, like the story that I share is about like my father's deportation. It's really deeply personal. It was a really horrific time in my life, right? But like as an activist organizer, I would constantly have to go to like a quick news clip, and they'd be like, so tell us your story really quick, tell us what happened to you, like let's get that like little sound bite to humanize you as a Muslim, right? And it just, like a lot of times, like especially as a young activist, you don't realize what's happening, but over time it accumulates, and it just starts to feel really superficial and almost like you're being used, like your story is being used, and for what, like, so it's being used for you're always told like, well, this is just for people, because like, we don't want people to hate Muslims, and you're just thinking to yourself like, so I have to constantly give this part of myself for people, who are not doing the work, right, to learn more about like their neighbors and their fellow, like the people who are living amongst them. So quick story short, so like when an Active Worship came to me, I was like, no way I'm going to be in another media clip, no way I'm going to be in another documentary. And what was really different about this experience was that Nosheen was like a Pakistani American, like, they're just a few years older than me. And like, we were able to bond in that way. She was like, well, I've like, here's all the crap that I've been through. And, and I know what you're talking about. But we and there was this immediate kind of like shared understanding that like we had shared this this experience of growing up in an Islamophobic USA together. So it was the first time that I felt really I guess safe to be vulnerable, right? And I had done other media projects where people were very kind, and I really enjoyed working with them, but this felt really intentional because I knew it just wasn't me, but I knew it was a story of so many other people, and that it was going to be really important for us to have our own narrative, and it was made by a Muslim, and that was really made to heal people, and it wasn't just made to like teach people about us. So that was just personally how it felt to be part of an act of worship. And one last thing that I'll mention is that I'm not just a participant in an act of worship, but I'm now currently the impact producer for an act of worship, which means that I was hired by the film team to actually get to plan, the screenings and all of the workshops and events and the conversations that, are complementing the screenings that we're having across the country. And that's really amazing as somebody who's a participant in a documentary to actually be part of the use of that documentary, to be part of like sometimes you're part of a media project and you don't know what it'll be used for. You don't know where it'll be screened. You don't know what the conversations are going to be around it. Maybe it's not exactly what you intended. But I really feel like I have a lot of agency in this particular project. And it's something that I think a lot of other documentaries can learn from, about like bringing their participants into the fold of the project and asking them, what do they want this project to be used for?
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Abir. I really appreciate your sharing. And in fact, it like has a great segue to talking with Pardeep about Not in Our Town and how you became involved in this work, really surrounding around the time Patrice O'Neill came to do a documentary about the community response after the shooting at the Oak Creek Gurdwara on August 5th, 2012. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about how you were involved. We'd love to hear a little bit about that, and then why it's important for you to be involved in that documentary process, but then as you've continued on, like to help other communities and to produce other films.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cassandra. And it's an honor to be on with Abir and Hussein. And I think Nina's there as well. But yeah, so my journey, 11 and a half years ago, our community was impacted by a hate crime that took the lives of 7 individuals, one of those people being my father, and temple president. A white supremacist came into the Sikh temple and murdered 7 people. And I think our community was trying to figure out how to respond. This is 2012 again, different political climate, a lot of similarities to what is going on right now. But as I kind of reflect on what Abir shared, really thinking about 9/11, the impact of it, and the Islamophobia that would follow in the aftermath. Question that I oftentimes get is, do you think that Sikhs were confused for Muslims or Muslims for Sikhs? And while there's nothing to kind of qualify that or validate it, I think the feeling of there could have been something where communities are targeted because of their religion or their race or ethnicity. And we thought it, for us, rather than answer the question of who is confusing for who, we have to stand up for all of our communities and any community that is impacted by hate, but also shed some emphasis on, the narrative after 9/11 and how that messaging by politicians and other people was putting Muslims at risk. And so, yeah, we kind of went forward and tried to do our best to put a brave face on for the world. And within that, Patrice O'Neill came to town with Not in Our Town, and they worked a lot on documentary filmmaking. 25 years now of, highlighting what happens to community, but not just what happens to community or educating, but what community can do to take action. So our focus as far as like engaging in the storytelling process, but to inspire action. And this was something that everybody can get involved with, as far as like communal stakeholders from, obviously we have law enforcement, we have faith-based groups, we have schools, we have civic organizations, and every one of us can do something about the rise of hate in America. And she really took us through what I thought was a pretty good trauma-informed process, meaning not having you relive, retake, doing this or that, but just kind of organically capturing, as if you're a fly on the wall, of what the emotion is, trying to tell a story about not just what happened, but like what was the spiritual impact of this on the community. And sometimes that is very hard to kind of, like let people know, because we all come in with our mindset and our experiences in life. And what we really need to engage in the film sort of process is, how do we empathize maybe with a community that we don't know a lot about, or we haven't known a lot about it? How do you inspire people, as we said, kind of like to engage and learn on their own? Because it shouldn't be just the community saying, hey, let me tell you the worst time in my life where I gone through this grief and we're going through these feelings, and rip that open every time just so that you can see my humanity. It should be, how do we proactively see each other's humanity? And so Waking in Oak Creek came out of that whole process. And as we kind of went forward, we started to see other communities impacted by hate. One of our latest films is Repairing the World, which highlights kind of not just what happened to the community in Pittsburgh 5 years ago, but how communities gathered around the Jewish community in Pittsburgh after the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in US history. And a lot of the documentary, Repairing the World, really highlights the response from the Muslim community. So the Muslim community after that attack, obviously, I mean, we hear a lot about Jewish Muslim tensions. We hear a lot about geopolitical conflicts. We oftentimes don't understand the brotherhood and the sisterhood that the Abrahamic faiths, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and all interfaith relations, how much of it that they share, right? That's not highlighted in the narrative of what we deem as like us and them and this and that. So this particular documentary does highlight that, and how the Jewish community, actually came and helped the Muslim community came and actually helped the Jewish community there by raising money, by providing security for those mosques and for the synagogues, and vice versa, and how interfaith collaboration can really work, not just from a let's respond in the aftermath of hate, but how interfaith communities are really needed as you go forward to preventively respond. And so that's most of the work that we do now, is to engage communities to not just respond in the aftermath, but really how can you come together, trust, build relationships that are authentic, and really, let people know that everybody stands together, and there is no place for hate that's justified towards any community.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. One of the things when you were talking, it reminded me of after the Pittsburgh shooting, it was just about 5 months later when there was the Christchurch massacre, and 51 Muslims killed attending mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. One of the images I remember from that time was like a political, like cartoon image of like a woman wearing hijab and like hugging a person wearing a kippah, and like just the closeness that has developed with communities who've experienced, especially being targeted by white supremacy. And I've heard that yourself and other leaders that have experienced this, particularly in your community, reach out to communities as it impacts them. And so reaching out to folks at the Mother Emanuel, reaching out to the folks like in Buffalo, New York, when the grocery store there. Can you share like how leading and doing this kinds of work impacts healing and impacts like trauma processing? Because yes, because I know you've written about trauma healing in this work, and so I'm curious like how that has impacted your own healing, but also how you've seen it with other communities.
Sure. And from a communal standpoint, thinking about communal trauma and a lot of the work that NIAT does, also work with a lot of young men who get involved in radicalization and go into white supremacist organizations, whether they are, the Klan, 3%ers, anti-government, some of this conspiracy theory, incel, all of this is kind of, right, this bad recipe of a spiritual disease known as white supremacy. And people don't, I mean, they're like, okay, like white supremacy, yes, we have to talk about it from a systemic level. We have to talk it from a historical, traumatic level. We have to talk about it from an individual level. But this is also something that we need to talk from a faith and spiritual level, because when we're engaging in something like this, and people don't know it, but when they have this sort of disease, right, to have power over rather than power with, that's a disease, right? It is insatiable. And young men are going through it and they're suffering from it, whether they know it or not, right? And this country has suffered from it from a very long time. And it is deeply embedded into the soil of this country. So it becomes on all of us to have the courage to dig into ourselves and say, okay, I have to serve, like they're at Christchurch, right? In New Zealand, other places of worship are being attacked. At some point, we have to understand that faith is being attacked. Why is faith being attacked? Faith is being attacked because they're trying to attack our sense of like hope, our sense of compassion, our sense of what is best in a human being and the dignity of who we are, right? Because this disease has overtaken so many people. They don't understand how much it's embedded into all of us. So for us, it's really to conquer that with compassion, conquer that with what we know best, and within filmmaking, capture those that are doing this work and can walk the lives of Aber and Hussein and yourself and Nina and other folks, and say, hey, let's stop giving hate such a megaphone. Let's stop giving division such a megaphone, because we unintentionally are doing the work of and I don't know if like the devil or the forces of evil or darkness or whatever that is, but that's kind of what we're doing. Let's really be who we're supposed to be and really shed light. But when we have those moments when we feel down, dejected, out of it, hopeless, let's lean in our faith, and our faith calls upon us to really bring about this goodness.
Yeah, thank you. And I know like Sikhi wisdom talks about radical connectedness, and this idea that we are all in creation and creation is in everyone and everything. And so this idea that we're all connected. And from my own studies about how trauma works, about trauma sort of impacting our language centers because we're not able to understand what's happening to us or to our community. And so a part of healing from that is finding language and creating language, and you do that through community, through coming together and trying to figure out together what's happening. And so it's really, really powerful when communities who have been similarly impacted reach out.
Yeah,
in
but
those
it
moments.
is, if we think about, and I'm no, forgive me on this, I'm going to be a sick speaking about Islam and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon.
Yeah.
But if God and Allah was Almighty, is strong enough to be able to create everyone who looked the same, everyone who walked the same, talked the same, dressed the same, whatever, believed the same, but they gave us a great spiritual challenge in this lifetime, right? And the lifetime is create diversity so that people can have the consciousness to recognize God in everybody and outside of themselves. If you can only recognize it in people that are whatever, look like you, talk like you, walk like you, dress like you, eat like you, believe like you, then you've cheapened this experience in life and you haven't done what you needed to do. So I think that's within Sikhi, within Islam, within Christianity, within the Torah, Buddhist, Baha'is, it's not to say that everything is the same, right? But we're uniquely special, and let's embrace that uniqueness.
Yeah. And I think to bring up the quote that Aber said earlier, the specific is universal in some of our religious traditions, at least for me as a Christian, like that's how I think of when I'm studying and learning from other folks of other religions. Well, let's turn to our local academic then for the next piece. Hussein, in your work as a professor, you focus on religion, pop culture, and specifically how Muslims are portrayed in culture. And some of the things that have already been coming out in this conversation is trying to move away from this popular narrative of Muslims as either, and people who are perceived as Muslim as either a victim or a villain. And so like, how has like films like Miss Marvel and other like similar like pop culture creations really helped shift that narrative? And has there been any surprising conversation points that have come up in those times?
Great, thank you. I want to start by thanking Shoulder to Shoulder, Cassandra, for inviting me to be here. And I'm so humbled. Being a New Yorker, been a big fan of Abir for many a year, and the work that I do, Pardeep and his work has just been monumental, and I can't short sell it. So it's really humbling to be on a panel with these two really wonderful individuals. I think, and just as a community note, before I put on that academic hat, as Pradeep is talking as a Sikh man about Islam, as a Muslim, to know that my experience with the Sikh community is that they have never walked away from the Muslim community and have never said we are not them, but have walked with Muslim communities, in my experience, has really been, as you said, really one of the most heartening aspects of all of this, is to know that we do walk together. So with the proper thanks and adab for that as well. Now, to put on that academic hat and to, Cassandra, turn to the question you were asking, recognizing this is kind of a small world. I wrote the education guide for an act of worship for PBS. So if, by the way, when you go to the link that Nina put in the chat, do make sure you check out the guide as well. I think it's pretty good. No bias, but I think it's also a useful teaching and community building tool to think about the film. And I also worked as a reviewer for Stranger at the Gate, the Emmy-nominated short documentary that you mentioned as well. So being an academic isn't just reading and writing about this stuff, but I think it's also engaging with this. And I lay that out there because I think it gives me an advantage to think about how some of these films work. You mentioned, obviously, Stranger at the Gate. You were obviously talking about Act of Worship, and you asked me about Miss Marvel. So I think it's worth taking a second just to talk about how these different films work. Abir has spoken beautifully about what it meant to have a Muslim filmmaker behind it. And, I think it takes somebody like Nosheen, who is an artist, is a networker, but also understands the nuances. I mean, there are things that being part of a Muslim community you see in that film because Nosheen sees them. She takes it as for granted. In a way a non-Muslim filmmaker wouldn't be able to represent. The flip side of that, and this is not to denigrate the work of non-Muslim filmmakers, is Josh Seftel, who is the director behind Stranger at the Gate, really brought together. He said, I'm not going to see what you see, so tell me how to tell a Muslim story. And if you look at all the people he consults, he's really trying to tell a very complex Muslim story, which I don't think necessarily a Muslim filmmaker is necessarily invested in the same way, because they have different sensibilities and a different film, right? In other words, Islam is not one thing because Muslims are so diverse, right? So each of these communities are bringing in different lenses. And I've also seen really just terrible, and I won't name names here, but I've seen some really terrible representations of Muslims that have been signed off on by Muslim individuals and Muslim organizations because they're just think they're privileged enough to be in the room, which is not an attitude I take. Like, if we're there, we have to hold creatives accountable, both by Muslims and non-Muslims. And I think when you come to Miss Marvel, I think for me, this is very exciting. So before, the series on Disney Plus was based on a comic book. And I had written an op-ed for, I think it was CNN, before the comic book had even come out. And I said, the most surprising thing about Miss Marvel is not that she's Muslim, because there have been other Muslim superheroes in the comics world, is not that she's Muslim, but is that she's from New Jersey. And I think that's an important part of the narrative, right? When was the last time you heard of a superhero from New Jersey? At least a serious superhero from New Jersey. And I said that was the most surprising thing. And when the comic book series was being run, I was approached by a woman named Jessica Baldanzi to see if we could co-edit a book. We were introduced by a mutual friend, Shabana Mir. And I said, for me, the interesting thing about Miss Marvel is, in fact, and I'm saying this as a scholar of religion and Muslims in US popular culture, the interesting thing for Miss Marvel for me is not that she's Muslim, but how little her religion plays a role in who she is. In other words, it's defining for who she is, and it's not hitting you over the head. It's not her praying all the time. It's not her, all the traditional practices that people associate with being Muslim. It's about the ethics of what it means to be Muslim, the way most Muslims live their lives, right? This is, I think, the power of an act of worship, right? I think there's only one scene where you see people praying in the entire movie. Otherwise, it's people living their lives, talking to their parents, talking to their siblings, talking to their friends. That to me is the power of Miss Marvel. And so when it's translated to screen, you see a lot of that coming into play. There is a little bit more explicit religiosity, but I think because there are things that needed to be told in the story. In other words, it served narrative effect, not didactic, not intentional explicit teaching effect. And I think that was really the strength. And I think here you can see some of the dual nature, right? It's Miss Marvel sits in this larger Marvel universe that has to serve a narrative function where lots of non-Muslims and non-Muslim sensibilities are involved in terms of what should be visualized. And then you look at who's behind the camera in terms of writing, directing, starring, and there are lots of Muslims, and that adds a different layer. And you can see how they navigated that space. And I think navigated really quite well. I mean, there are always places where one can criticize, even on the things I love. But overall, I think they handled it very, very well. And I think it's about what I think Miss Marvel does, moving us totally out of the documentary sphere. I think what Miss Marvel does is it takes the everyday and forces you to see it in new ways, right? And that to me is the purpose of good art, is how do you take the things that you normally see and see it in new ways and see it in unexpected ways that allow you to open your mind. Right. And I think that to me was the power of Miss Marvel, the TV series.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think in interfaith work, we often talk about there's sometimes the danger of saying, like, let's learn about each other's religion, which is good to know, like, what are the 5 pillars of Islam? What are the foundations of Sikhi? Those are good things. And yet the lived experiences of people is really, for me and for a lot of us, is like where you start to really understand different communities, and where you start to understand how you said, like, how the ethics of that religious foundation, of that spiritual cultural foundation, really start to live out in your everyday. You've said also, like, in the past about how, like, documentaries and or pop culture films have changed over time, especially, like, we're going to say, like, let's say since 2000, like, how have documentaries and how storytelling about, like, these topics changed? What can we tell now? Like, could act of worship been told 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago? Like, so I'm curious, like, your thoughts on that.
Oh, what a great question about active worship. I think you could have had a documentary, and in fact, it wouldn't surprise me if we did, because there's a lot of media that's been lost to us, but a documentary about the American Muslim experience 30 years ago, it probably actually would have focused much more on the Black experience of Islam in the United States. As we know, Black Muslims are the largest racial group of Muslims in the United States. For centuries, they've been in this country. And if you're talking 30 years ago, you're talking about the early post-1965 generation of immigrants. We're a minority. I consider I'm a descendant of that cohort. They were and we are continue to be a minority. And working in the arts was not a high priority. But I think from a commercial perspective, I don't think you would have seen it picked up by PBS, right? The late great Edward Said, professor at Columbia, is often, he's most well known for his book Orientalism, but he has another book called Covering Islam, where he says, the government and media and academia all have a role in creating narratives around Islam, and it's usually in purpose of power. maintaining power, maintaining status quo. So when you look for 2000, which is what you're using as the cutoff, right? All the narratives around Islam are barbarians, savages, violent, right? Not Without My Daughter, True Lies. I'm sure there are others I'm forgetting, but those are the ones that come immediately to mind, And then sometimes there's the bait and switch. It's the Arabs who are the enemy. No, it's the Soviets. And 24 played with this a little bit. The TV series 24 played with this a little bit. But I think at a certain point, there was a growing consciousness amongst creatives, not just for Muslims, but on questions of race, on questions of sexuality, that the way these stories were told were harming these communities, right? There was a study that came out and coming back to 24, I think 24, I'm gonna use days as an example. I don't remember now, but I think 24 used to come out on Tuesday nights. There would be a spike in Islamophobic attacks Wednesday mornings because people were revved up after watching 24. You could literally see a correlation. Right now, correlation isn't causation, but it's one of those things where you're like, oh yeah, let me do a whole hour on why you should hate brown people. And then the next morning, brown people start getting beat up. Like, I mean, so people started thinking, okay, how do we do this a little bit more responsibly? And then you started getting people involved in in the storytelling. And I think it made a huge shift. So I think active worship in the form it is now could only be done now. Stranger at the Gate in the form it is now could only be done now. The documentaries that Pardeep is doing could only be done now. But the fact of the matter is that it is because there's been such violence and such trauma visited in our communities that it's activated a sense of, I wonder if I have a role in this, rather than let me treat other people with decency from the get-go. And I think that's a deeper underlying problem we need to address.
Thank
Can
you so
I just
much.
say something about that really quickly?
Yeah, go ahead. I was about to turn it over to y'all.
I just want to like highlight Hussein's point of like when you think about films and you think about even kind of mainstream kind of funding, you think about things that are feeding the consciousness of America where it is. You can go back to lots of war films that, and not that we were able to do, but that were told to the American public, and some of them highlighted sort of like this brown bad guy, to say, okay, I need, and this is the flip side of it, like the growing sort of white pride, does that have to come at the expense of the brown bad guy? And so it may not even justify an act of violence. It may not even escalate. I mean, I think it does, as Hussein pointed out, but it gets into the subconscious of parents who are taking their kids, who may feel like, hey, you know what, life is changing for me. This demographic is changing, and it's getting browner, it's getting blacker, it's getting this, and it's getting that. They're not feeling themselves inside the world of the United States, and those feelings get weaponized. And those feelings get weaponized to say, hey, it's not because your dad didn't tell you that they love you enough. I'm going to take you to go watch American Sniper and show you that, like, the enemy, and the enemy is this brown bad guy. And that's taken in with a story about sort of American exceptionalism related to the hero being another person who mainstream audiences will say, I'll go see that. Right? I'll go watch that. And you're like, well, what was the effect on your child? And this is what we see in our, like, the effect on your child was, for the momentary part of that, they went back and they felt better about themselves, but it only lasted so long, because it's something that you have to keep fueling, right? It's like it's like you're not giving somebody a sense of pride or self-esteem that comes from self. It comes from disliking somebody else. And that's not a richness in film. It's just something that you have to keep doing over and over again.
I think just to continue building is thinking as well how film socially conditions us, right? Which I think Pradeep's point, the types of social violence that it inculcates, the cultural violence that it inculcates, that brown people are inherently the enemy. And again, this is why I think it's important to highlight most Muslims in this country are not brown. And that's not to say, please don't attack brown people, but to think about just how we're socialized and conditioned to think about this. But I think about, there was a movie called Three Kings with George Clooney, Ice Cube, and Mark Wahlberg. And it's a pre-2001 movie. It's about the US's first invasion of Iraq. And there's some problems with the movie. I'm not going to recommend it uncritically. But one of the things it does is it talks about how the Shia communities of Iraq felt betrayed by the US after the first invasion. And what's striking about this, for me, is that people talk about Islamophobia rising after 9/11, but coming from Shia communities, you date it to actually the 79 revolution in Iran, right? That's really the geopolitical moment that really starts cementing this. It's got a longer intellectual history, but I think for the contemporary period, you look at 79, and people don't register Shia as difference. They don't register what's happening in the film in Three Kings as a critique of US policy, right? And because if you took the last 45 minutes of that film seriously and the failures of US policy in Iraq, we would have had a very different conversation around the 2003 invasion. And I think because we have this social frame that brown guys are always the baddies, we teach this 5 pillars, we teach Sunni normativity, we don't think about the diversity and difference within Islam, right? All the different types of Muslims that there are. We blank out all this stuff when we say, yes, this film was about Muslims being the bad guys as opposed to a critique of US policy. And so, yes, Three Kings ends up being a justification for the 2003 invasion because nobody's actually reading it consciously because they're so socialized to reading brown Muslims as the bad guy. That's a long way of saying I agree with you, Pradeep.
No, for sure. I think that Abir, I wanted to give you a chance to, you're reflecting a little bit on that, and yeah, just I think we all remember those movies of like, oh, and I think for me it's cringeworthy. Honestly, sometimes I'm just like, and somebody mentions it in the conversation, and I'm like, oh. And then you're like, how am I going to be able to explain what I feel to to this person? And you're like, how do you provide an explanation for lived experience, right? And sometimes it becomes, for many times it's just like an academic exercise. Not who's saying I'm not downing academics, but you also are not like a typical academician. Okay, you went into spirituality and you went into some other things, so you weren't like a hollow academia. Not that you guys are hollow, but I think that you're trying to give this lived experience to people, and I think within the dynamic of America and what we live in, right? For me, it is an academic exercise for me to identify as a woman, for me to identify as white, for me to it's not my lived experience, right? And for other people, we give them the grace and say, yeah, for you, everything that you've learned about this existence, you've either, you've had some experience with, but you probably learned it academically. And how do you get it back to the lived experience and being able to explain that? And really, again, like getting to a place of empathizing with it.
Yeah, can I also respond to Pardeep? Thanks for opening up for me. I'm just like, so many just mind-blowing things that are being said here in this conversation. But one of the things that just this last couple of back and forth was reminding me of was how during the filming of An Act of Worship, like I remember I was not like part of the film team, but again, because of the fact that it was just like this Muslim filmmaker, we just became friends over the period of time. Like I knew a lot of like what was going on with the production of the film. And there was a big burden on An Act of Worship of being like this documentary that was like so ambitious. We want to show the Muslim experience, of like the last 30 years of Muslim experience. And it was so hard. Like, can we get every single race, ethnicity, like gender, sexual diversity? Like, can we actually encompass all of that in one documentary? And it was really, really impossible, right, to do. I think I think Nosheen did her best as like a filmmaker, but I think that's also like one of the burdens that this new generation of filmmakers has on themselves, kind of coming in, it's like Hussein was saying before, like, I don't think people would have been able to make these projects 30 years ago, because they just probably would not have been able to have their foot in the door, whether that's like culturally because, people weren't encouraged to go into the arts, but there's so many barriers even within like the world of arts, filmmaking, et cetera, right? To actually enter the door, get funding for your film, to be able to create these stories. So there is a huge like burden of, like having to explain, who you are. But I've seen amazing projects that have actually, like defied this. So like when I think of Miss Marvel and that point that you were making, Hussein, about like, it's not hitting you on the head with its Muslimness, like the story is not obsessed with her being a Muslim. And like, I think a lot of us really appreciate that. And I can say, as someone who's like a participant in different media pieces, like something that I would get asked a lot is like, so why did you wear hijab, right? And this is often coming from like an audience that's like so perplexed by you wearing hijab, and like they're seeing it as such a, a big, I don't know, they're seeing it as a big burden, or they're seeing it as this like really kind of brave thing that you're doing. And so much of like the media around Muslims is around hijab. And for me, like my answer to that is like, I wore hijab when I was 11, and I think it was because like the older girls in my masjid, I just thought they were really cool, and they would wear like fake nails and makeup, and they wore hijab, and like I was 11 and I thought that was really cool and I wanted to be like them. That's really the reason, right? But they don't want that reason. They want you to talk about like just the struggle, and so I think for us to be able to have like spaces where we can live in our full humanity amongst one another is really, really important. And having like Muslim, creators be part of that, or creators from our own backgrounds be part of that is like one step. But I think it's also another step of us to have that like deeper understanding that Pardeep was talking about, to really, like actually strive to get to know one another on a deep basis, and not just on this superficial basis that's like based off of what we've seen, on TV screen, or what we're told in the news and the media.
Want to leave it open for any other questions from you all to each other. I have a whole list of questions as well.
Well, I think for me, what I'd like to hear from Pardeep as a creative, Aber as a community person is, if we weren't busy. I'm framing this in the context of the Toni Morrison quote, right? The serious work of racism is to keep us distracted, right? Like if we didn't have to make these films in response to tragedy or think with tragedy, if we didn't have to make these films to say we're human, what would we be doing? What would we be creating? And I'll start out like I'm very happy with my job because I know my boss is going to see this. I want to be clear. But if Marvel came knocking and said, hey, do you want to write a comic book script for us that has nothing to do with religion? It's just a superhero bang up. Yeah, I'm all over it. Call me, Marvel, Kevin Feige, call me up. I'm right there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that we'd be creating consciousness and connection that was a bit deeper to help. So when I think about, somebody said, Party, if I give you a magic wand and you can do something, and you could address a lot of the issues that exist, I would say create broad-scale mental health for everyone to be able to access, because there's so much that I see as a clinician as well, of like, and it's not just diagnosable mental health. It is about community health. It is about some of the way that we've been conditioned, the way that we have learned how to navigate the existence of gender, of all kinds of dynamics. We are extremely troubled and we are suffering. Maybe not to the scale of suffering, something tragic happening to a community or multiple tragedies happening to communities, but we are all in this suffering together. And because that connection and the consciousness and that, like, we're not being proactive with it, we're being reactive to it, and we're having to address a lot of that at like such a superficial level. We're not really getting to we're not getting to a place where we're actually really thriving, right? Where we're surviving, where these films that we're making are essential because we're surviving. We're not, I mean, some people, I mean, I think are really saying, hey, let me go and learn about, this or that or this, but it's not the mainstream. It's not, the mainstream is really like we're stuck in a place, and whether it's kind of getting in the way of us saying, hey, we could actually have a society, we could have a world where we could be connected and conscious, and everybody can kind of have, right? But we've been conditioned to kind of think we can only have if somebody doesn't. We have to be, and that sort of comparative value that we put on each other and ourselves is creating a sense of suffering. At some point, you got to say, I want out of this rat race of whatever life is, and I don't need to comparatively value myself according to you. I want to go inward and comparative, like I'm me. And so I think people just kind of, they're stuck.
Yeah. Actually, I would really love to just continue your thought, Pradeep, because it's so interesting that you just brought up mental health. Because when Hussein asked that question, look, Hussein, I'm not a creative. I mean, maybe sometimes I'll tap into it, right? But there are amazing Muslim creatives that exist, but as the impact producer, right? As the person of an act of worship, as the person who was working with a team to figure out what do we do with this film. It's been really interesting of how it's been used. So a lot of people would naturally think we would use an act of worship in two ways, which is we would either use it as an educational tool for non-Muslim communities to teach them about Islamophobia and the Muslim American experience, or in the Muslim community, it's very policy based. So you would think it's going to be used to rev up our activism. And that's a major, when you're part of the Muslim community, there's an obsession with our activism, which is really, really important, but there's an obsession with the political story. So what's been interesting about how we've developed our impact campaign is that we've actually made almost the entire impact campaign about mental health. So we go to different spaces and we use the film as a catalyst, right? So we screen it for people, but we actually realize that so many deep emotions come up for people. People have been so isolated in their experience for so long that it's actually almost, it brings up their trauma. And for many, maybe they haven't even had a space to talk about this, right? Depending on their community and the resources. So we've actually paired the film, and we've been partnering with the Muslim Wellness Foundation for many of our events, who are an amazing organization. And we've been doing mental health facilitations around the film. And so I think that's just really, really amazing in terms of, this film can definitely be used for so many different things. So what are we going to put our resources into? And there is a major need for healing, and there's a major need for processing what this community has experienced in so many ways, and giving people that space that they've felt a lot of shame to enter. So that's really how I am thinking of what things I would like to see. But I also want to kick the question back to Hussein, because I know that you're a Pillars Fellow, you're part of a narrative change cohort, you're doing so much around and working with a lot of Muslim creatives, but also you're in that stratosphere. So now that we've talked hey, we're at the time, this is the time for us, right? What are the stories that either you're seeing or hope to see coming out of this period?
Oh, that's a great question, Abir. I'm humbled by the answer both you gave. I really wasn't thinking in terms of community work. I was really thinking in terms of creative, artistic creation, but obviously creating the types of networks and support systems that you're both talking about are so desperately needed. But I think, the stories I would like are some of the messy stories. The New York. Look, I'm a New Yorker. I might be in Cambridge now, but I'm a New Yorker. Abir knows what that means. It's we're all a hot mess, and I'd love to get some of those stories. We're all walking sitcoms. I want us to have each a sitcom of our own, and figure that out. But also, I want jinn stories out there that aren't horror stories. They can be, but not all jinn stories have to be horror stories. And I want some of those. I want the romances, there's the Stans and the Masnavis and those Layla and Majnun type stories and the Shirin Khosrow, those are the ones I want out there. Like, we can give telenovelas a run for their money, and I think we should just bring it, with the classic literature, So I want to do that.
And we call Hallmark because, holiday rom-com season is about to come, and I'm all about like some more newness in that field.
Cassandra, that's great. I mean, our holiday season, Ramadan holiday season, we've got another 5 months, so Hallmark can at least produce a couple before then. I think we've got enough time to do that. And then Hallmark can just be holiday rom-coms all the time and just everybody else's holidays. So
yes, that would be so fun. So fun. I think yeah. Oh my God, this would be great.
I was saying, because there's a point where you're talking about the hot mess, and I was thinking about like Muslim life because we're thinking about Muslim life, but I was thinking about Desi life. I was thinking about Punjabi life, and I was like, man, we should have a sitcom of our own called like Brownish, and just like tell some stories about that.
There's Queens in New York, and sorry, Queens is the best borough. I say this with a Brooklynite there, but is the most diverse borough in New York, which means it's probably the most diverse geography in all of the United States. And I think you could probably just like run down, two of the streets and see, the change in the different neighborhoods, and like just hop from restaurant to restaurant and be like, how is this like a burrito? How is this like a samosa? And just like run down and like, it's, food sample and insult everybody at the same time. And then dine and dash. It's the best comic series I think you can get.
Love it. Love it. I've actually been talking with a couple of comics that we met at a comic show called Browntown in DC. Shoulder to Shoulder hosted a comedy show here in DC with a couple of folks that lead a Browntown. And it was so much fun. It was such a good, and to your point, Abir, about healing, like it was so healing just to laugh at the absurdity of some of the stuff that happens in our country and in our world. I'd love to turn again to the folks that would be watching this either right now or later in recording, about like, we're talking about how to use films for community engagement, whether that's community healing, whether that's activism and engagement. What are some examples that you three have seen? Did we just lose Hussein? No, he's still there. That you three have seen work. Like, what are some things that have worked for you? And we'll start with you, Pardeep.
Yeah, for us, I mean, Waking Oak Creek, we were able to share with thousands of screenings. And I know that at the end of those screenings, we always asked, what is it that you can do? Not like, in a year, but tomorrow. What can you do to prevent hate? What can you do to get to know? And I think just calling on, again, like calling on action right away, the immediacy of it, like let's put it into practice tomorrow. Let's put it in practice tonight. Don't wait so long. Don't feel like you got to get prepared. Wherever you are in your capacity, right? We can do something about it. And so just I think just there's going to be places that I know that I cannot be at. There's probably places that Abir knows that she cannot be at. Hussein knows that he will not be at. Right? We utilize these platforms to be able to reach broader audiences, but there's just some places that we cannot be at. So we need to rely on genuine allyship and connection and say, hey, can you talk to those folks that wouldn't talk to me, and advocate for my existence, and then I can talk with them as well. But I think just encouraging people to have a conversation, start the conversation, see something outside of your comfort zone. Whatever it is that we exist in, we all have biases. This thing right here is, it's a supercomputer, but every one of ours is somewhat, it's limited. Right. And until we get out of it and say, hey, how do I intentionally get out of my comfort zone? How do I intentionally watch something that I would not watch? How do I eat something that I would not eat? How do I experience life that I would not experience? And then calling ourselves to that challenge as well.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things we talk about at Shoulder to Shoulder, both in our community trainings as well as in other engagement, is that you don't need to be an expert in Sikhism and Islam and Islamophobia and anti-Muslim discrimination or even racism to recognize when someone's dignity is being challenged or being diminished. And to address that, you know what it's like to care for other people. And so that and we talk about different strategies for doing that, but we always say you don't need to be an expert to take that first step to address the misinformation that's circulating around you. Aber, do you have some thoughts for us on this?
Yeah, I actually thought maybe this would be a really good opportunity to share a clip that I want to talk about from our film.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm gonna attempt to share it. Bismillah, I hope it works out. Let's see if it plays for everyone. Can people hear it? Okay.
Nope, sadly.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Maybe we should skip the clip. Sorry, folks, we tried to incorporate videos, but it's very difficult for us not tech savvy people. Do you want to try? Okay, let's see if it works.
That was Nina, for those of you who...
I remember the video starting with the job description for someone who decides to join ISIL, showing men with masks, wielding AK-47s, going around different neighborhoods and killing pedestrians, and blood seeping from their skeletal remains, and like mosques being blown up. I left the auditorium feeling angry and unsafe. I couldn't believe that our principal would allow something like that. I felt like the administration was now watching us differently. Do they think we're inherently violent? Is there something about our teachings or the way in which we're raised? You have to show us this in order to deter us from joining a terrorist organization. And as a young Black Muslim, started to look at the world differently.
Thanks so much for that, Nina. Just to give you all some context on the clip that I just showed, it's a clip from an act of worship, and one of our participants, Ikran Abdurrahman, was talking about an experience of, being in her high school in Minnesota and which has been highly impacted by the CVE countering violence extremism program, which a lot of Muslims are opposed to because of the approaches of the program, especially in terms of surveillance communities and not actually allowing people safe spaces because of the feeling of being surveilled. And so this is an instance of this film, this really, really scary film that's showing people being blown up, et cetera, being shown to entire audience, I think predominantly Somali young Muslim high schoolers, and this is to tell them not to be radicals, right? So this is not the approach to that. And one of the things that it's been really, that community has been really impacted by the CVE program. And Ikran and her family have been impacted. I think her brother has been arrested, under kind of counterterrorism laws. And when she was becoming part of an act of worship, she didn't want to become part of the project because a lot of people had done media pieces. And I think there was even an entire documentary that was made about her community that she was part of, that she felt really did not take her narrative, seriously and mistold the story or did not tell the story the right way that she had wanted, and it wasn't really what she felt was happening in the community, but it was a story that was centered around radicalization from this very kind of American nationalist lens. And one of the things that we tried to do as part of like the process of our impact campaign, was trying to like restore dignity to the communities who were like highly impacted by these policies. So like when we went to Minnesota, you know, we actually did a fundraiser for Ikran's brother and for like other people who had been impacted and arrested because of these policies. But one of the other things that's really important is that like I now like feel really strongly about like talking to young Muslim activists about like their participation in media, and like how not to allow media to use their narrative, but how to actually be able to like show up as a full human and actually even know your rights. Like when, you know, like people come to you and ask you to be in a documentary or a media piece, like what are your rights, and how can they do this in a dignified way for you and your community? So one of the things that like to your question is like, I think that film allows for a restorative kind of, you know, place in our community. I think it like allowing people to see themselves, allowing people to feel emotions together is like restoring a lot of what we've lost as a community, because one of the biggest impacts of Islamophobic policies is actually like it tears our communities apart. People don't trust each other anymore, and people feel very ashamed, and people stay isolated because of, you know, what's going on in their communities. So this is something that like I think that the film allows for the Muslim community. And then one of the other things is like, again, we don't want to just talk about like, okay, film just for the Muslim community, but like in an interfaith space, like this space, right? Like how can we use these stories to not just be like voyeurism of a community, but actually bring people to action? So one of the interesting things about like interfaith spaces that I've always thought like historically, like at post 9/11, interfaith spaces were like really used to like neutralize Muslims, I think, in a lot of ways. And it's like, talk about our relation to our Abrahamic faiths, but let's not talk about racism. Let's not talk about white supremacy. Like, let's not talk about Palestine, like all these types of things that you can't bring into those spaces. And I think that there was an event that like the Jewish Voices for Peace had like a few years ago, where they said like coexistence for co-resistance was like their tagline, and it was like an interfaith event. And I think like bringing our stories to an audience is about co-resistance, right? It's about actually like, how do we move together as communities? And it's not like, how do you just sympathize for me, right? Like, I don't want you to watch an act of worship or the story, like Pardeep's documentaries. So I don't want you to see these documentaries so you just cry about us, right? Like we want you to like actually move into action, right? And how do we like see each other as communities, as like people who have struggled and then can struggle together for a better future for all of our collective communities, like especially in the United States. So that's something that I think like in like communally, and then also outside of the Muslim community, are ways that the like films can be like really impactful.
Thank you so much. Hussein, do you have some, now that your camera is back working, how about some how you've seen films used for community engagement, and how that's worked when you've used that?
I don't have anything to add to what Pradeep and Aber have offered. I think they've spoken to experiences that mirror my own. I think I will just build briefly on Aber's last comment, which is you use the phrase coexistence equals co-resistance, and I understand where that's coming from. I appreciate that. I think also resistance means somebody else is setting the frame for us because we're resisting that frame. And I think, how do we build together, right? And I think there's times for resistance and there's times for imagining that new future. And recognizing, really building on what Aber said, our struggles cannot be seen as separate. Unless you're a white nationalist, and our struggles are absolutely separate. But otherwise, the rest of us, our struggles are joint struggles, they're combined struggles. And how do we struggle together? And how do we build something together? And a struggle, I don't think is necessarily somebody else setting the frame, but it's recognizing the human condition. And how do we move beyond and build beyond that?
I just want to add, some of the films that we're seeing, I think, are doing a better job of this narrative. I know Nayat were incredibly reflective and kind of go back and say, hey, like, obviously there's a way to story tell, the film tells it, but there's a way that the community organically has told it. and we want to capture that that realness. But as Hussein and Abir were talking, I was kind of reflecting on how the Muslim experience shows up sometimes as strength, but it's almost showing up as this dangerous strength. And what we tried to do in Repairing the World was like, no, the strength is really about compassionate strength. This is not, you know, and that's the sort of the narrative by lots of white nationalist groups around different conspiracies and theories and things like that, you know, including the Great Replacement theory or other ways of like somehow, some way that brown people having strength in this country is dangerous and we will lose our way of life. And that is a perversion to the utmost. And there's got to be ways to be able to correct that narrative. And, you know, so I think more and more films that people can see saying, hey, you know what, them having like whatever that group is, right? Whether it's Black, whether it's brown, whether it's, you know, and like marginalized groups, whether it's women, whether it's other people who may not feel like they have agency or strength, but their participation in this democracy makes our country strong and stronger, and we fulfill the promise of what America was meant to be, and hopefully we're going towards that.
Yeah, and I feel like in the last 10 years especially, there's been a lot more collaboration between communities within the US. There has always been, like you look at like the collaboration during the civil rights movement with the farm workers movement in California, and other movements, and including even during World War II with the internment of Japanese Americans. There has been collaboration and learning from each other, but it feels like that's been amplified in the last like 10 or so years. And so people are learning from each other. And one of the things I really valued about Pardeep, about the Repair the World film, was there's a scene, a section where you guys are talking to high schoolers in Pittsburgh and their response. And that to me is like oftentimes a missing voice within some of these documentary films of like, how are high schoolers who may or may not have attended those synagogues, how are they responding? And how is that a way that we can learn as a community to respond to each other and to strengthen each other and to hopefully reach mutual flourishing, is the way that I talk about it.
Yeah, I remember that conversation of just youth and them saying, you know, kind of psychologically how they were kind of in their own places and they had to get out of those comfort zones to say, yeah, I didn't know and that's what I've heard over and over again of parents, even parents who've instant message and said, you know, Pardeep, I didn't, you know, my racism shows up a little bit different than what happened to you, but I would go to my child's school and I would see certain kids playing with each other, and I would invite certain kids to a party that we were having for a birthday, but I didn't think to invite the other kids. And I didn't know that I was also kind of responsible for a lot of that. And it's good to hear that kind of reflection.
Yeah. Hussein, I saw you unmute a moment ago.
Was going someplace completely different, so I don't want to derail the thread right now.
Go right ahead.
There was I just want to revisit something Aber said, reminded me when you were asking about how stories around Muslims have changed, and I think this could segue a little bit from what you were talking with Pardeep about, is there's a series on the WB, one of the networks here, decades ago, called Aliens in America, about a Pakistani exchange student who comes to somewhere in Minnesota, I think. Does anybody remember this besides me? It's okay. So, but you know, it's all about cultural misunderstandings, and it's the early 2000s, and it's, you know, it's actually quite a funny sitcom, but it is a very much teaching about Islam type sitcom. You know, like it's very explicit about how you tie that in. And then there's a show that, sticking with the WB, that just came off the WB called Legends of Tomorrow, and it's one of the DC Universe's superhero shows, and it's an utterly ridiculous show. And I mean this in the best possible way, but it's ridiculous superheroism. But one of the characters on there, Zari Tomas, played by the actress Tala Ash, her Islam shows up so casually. Like one time, everybody's like, "Why are you so grumpy? You're the cheeriest one." And she's like, "I've been fasting for 2 weeks. It's Ramadan." And it's like, it's just that. And then you move on. And it's not, you don't make a thing of it. It's just built right in. Or they're doing a celebratory drink and she's like, "I don't drink." And everybody sort of nods and understands and moves on, right? It's like they forgot. She reminds them. And it's that sort of integrated, those things that people are expected to know. And if you don't know, it holds the audience to a standard of figuring it out rather than being didactic, rather than being explanatory about it. And unfortunately, it just aired its last season last year. But it is, I think that character, and I know from interviews, was deeply informed by the actress Tala Ash's involvement of her her experiences being a Muslim. And I think to Abir's point that, getting people behind the camera and in front of the camera has really changed the dynamic as well about the storytelling and the nuance and the assumptions that go in. Because it's not the writers discovering about Islam and then saying, "Oh, look what I just discovered about Islam and let me tell it to my audience." It's the actors and the writers who've lived that experience saying, the fact that we fast isn't important. It's the results that happen, right? It's like, what are the social implications that become important?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Well, we have about 8 minutes left, so I'd love to have any closing comments from each of you, remembering, and I see Nina just put in a question in the chat. Let's see, what show or movie were you just referencing, Hussein?
The show is called Legends of Tomorrow, and it just finished airing on the WB.
Legends of Tomorrow. It did remind me of my friends laugh at my choice in TV shows, that they tend to be very tied up in neat little bows. There's some drama, but the relationships get tied up. And part of my thinking sometimes is like, I just need a break from other things. But the other part is, what about examples of people, just like you said, just like, "You forgot that I don't drink. That's cool. Let's just move on." Like modeling different ways of relating to each other as healthy, maybe, or at least restorative. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up. So I'd love to have like any final comments from each of you for community leaders who are thinking about using film, whether it's a documentary or whether it's a series, a pop series, to engage community, whether that's in wellness and healing pieces, or whether that's activating folks to activism or community engagement. So why don't we start with you, Abir, and we'll go around the room to Pardeep and then Hussein.
Thanks. Okay, I was gonna say I want to go before Pardeep because he always just talks so deeply and thoughtfully that I don't want to. But I guess firstly, like just to what like Hussein was just saying, I know you mentioned like when you were reading my bio that like, okay, I was not in Brooklyn anymore. So what's really been interesting is that I've been living in South Africa for the past almost like 5 years now. And I'm here studying, I'm doing my master's, and I'm trying to learn about like liberation theology and learn about some of the Muslim engagement in anti-apartheid activism. But one of the things that's like so cool about this society, which I think like really does not have like institutionalized Islamophobia at all, right, is that Muslims are a minority here, but they're so engraved in the culture. And like one example that I can give is like, I was on a bus one day and like sitting behind me were like two, like older white ladies, and they were talking about their neighbors child, and they were like, "Oh, he has his hifz, classes that he has to go to." And hifz is a word that is like used to talk about like our kind of like after school Quran learning programs that like kids go to, right? So I'm like, these ladies are just using hifz casually in a conversation on a bus, and there's so much like vernacular here, like like inshallah or yallah, or like shukran, like all these types of words that like Muslims like use a lot, that I think like through being like seeing it in film like just becomes more normalized. And I think like that's really beautiful of us, just like especially with the Muslim immigrant experience, I would say like the total otherization I think can be like, I think like this generation can feel a lot more human in themselves, right, with like the allowance of people to really just like see their stories, but also learn their vernacular, learn about their cultures, learn about like, you know, their habits. So like that it's like, oh yeah, I just don't drink, just drinking some kombucha here. And it's like an afterthought, you know, like at the bar, it's like not even like a storyline, right? So I think like those are all really cool like possibilities of the future. And I think like film is an amazing catalyst. I've learned as an organizer about how the arts are so important to the work that we do, and they're not separate. And like all type of artistic expression can actually just be a way that people can be hit in a much more deeper level than they would have like just been hit if you gave them a political education course or even brought them to a protest. So I've learned a lot through this process, and I think that people should open up to bringing creativity and artistic possibilities into their movement spaces.
Yeah, thank you, Abir. Just and love to see what you're gonna work and do. And yeah, just I was trying to think about like just I can't get the hot mess out of my head, and you know, just embracing the hot mess. You know, us adults, we talked a lot about just kind of children and how children can be a catalyst for us kind of moving forward. You know, and us adults sometimes having so much locked into our heads that we're like we're overthinking. You know, a lot of us, we laughed during this. We had emotional moments. We evoked a lot of and film does that. Film sends off so much of your senses. And I don't mean to say a book is a different experience. Music is a different experience. All of that should be incorporated, right? But film has the ability to have us, embrace the mess, and really get to the place where we get to the best of us, which is, have the curiosity of the child, right? That's ancient wisdom. It's not the person who knows the most. It's not the person who has the most information. It is the person who is still absorbing and says, you know what, I'm humble enough to know that I don't know. And I want to learn. And I want to know about your life. And I want to know about other people's lives. And so children are in that special, unique place. So I think just, let's do some more around filmmaking and working with kids.
So I'm going to speak a little bit more prosaically. I share Abir's concern coming after Pardeep and thinking more deeply, but I'm going to be a little bit more prosaic and go into how do you use film. I think, people, I don't think we give people enough credit for their critical lens when watching television or film, right? I mean, people are always talking about the show they're watching or the movie they saw either right after, at work the next day, online, whatever it is. I don't give people enough credit for that. But I think the screen experience, we're almost conditioned to sit passively through it and then process it a little bit later and then actively engage with it. I don't think that's necessarily bad, but I think if we're using film for discussion, as a facilitator, I try to think a lot about how do I activate the critical, active mind for viewing prior to the discussion, prior to showing the film. So what are the guiding questions or ideas that I can give you prior to the film to make sure it's not passive, or to get you, make sure to trigger the first acts of active thinking that you can then continue throughout. So when the discussion happens after, people aren't thinking after the conversation is over, I didn't have enough time to think about it. I didn't think about this at the time. I wish I had the time to think about it, but are already primed to engage as soon as the film is over to start discussion. And you always need post-processing time. I'm not saying this is a panacea or you'll be done talking about it, but in that moment, when you're thinking about community, how are you priming people to enter that communal conversation right after?
Thank you so much. That's a really helpful point about that, having used many films in conversations myself over the years, thinking about how do we prime people into that. And I think about that as well as when there's an event type that happens all over, at least the United States, and I've seen it in other places where people go and tour other people's faith communities, like Sikhs, Gurdwaras, temples, synagogues, so on and so forth. And there's some folks that just put people in and let them go and then do the feedback. And so don't give them any primer. And having learned, it's like, no, people need just a little bit of primer at least before you go in. And so I really appreciate that comment. Thank you all. Thank you for all the work that you do, for your following the nudges to do the work that you do. And thank you so much for all of your wisdom here. Thank you, Hussein. I know you have to hop off now. I want to thank everybody. I want to also call your attention to a brand new resource on our website, which is a growing list of movies and books, including discussion guides when they're available, like from An Act of Worship and from Not in Our Town. And so we're going to put that in the chat for you. And we would love to have you start looking at that and using that. And we are here, Nina and I are here to help equip and connect you all and support you in your work to engage communities and to build that country where all of us are treated with dignity and respect, and that world, including in South Africa. And so thanks very much, everybody.